Hey guys, welcome to week 4, and this is going to be the short lecture over chapter 7, which is going to be covering the Civil War era, which is from 1856 to 1876. I think some of the key things I think to remember as we read through this chapter are that the years leading up to the Civil War brought a lot of critical issues that were dividing the country. Cities were beginning to face rapid growth in wealth of the Industrial Revolution, along with racial and ethnic tensions. And so as the cities began to face this rapid growth in ethnic tensions, it was up obviously to government, the police, the criminal justice system as a whole to deal with these issues that were taking place. The key criminal justice issue during the Civil War era was the suspension of civil liberties, especially the habeas corpus, the writ of habeas corpus, which is basically the ability of those being incarcerated to seek remedy in the courts. As to the questions as to why Lincoln suspended those are, obviously up to Lincoln, but since then, no other president has really faced the type of issues that Lincoln had faced, and so apparently he felt it was best to suspend those civil liberties during the course of the Civil War. Now, during this period of time, the black codes came to be, and this was established after the Civil War, and they were instituted by the southern states. And they were a means to erect a legal structure that would permit the economic exploitation of blacks by granting them technical freedom. And one of those codes is referenced on your textbook on page 145 as the Mississippi Black Code of 1865. And at section 3 it says, "Be it further enacted that it shall not be lawful for any freedman, free negro, or mulatto to intermarry with any white person, nor for any white person to intermarry with any freedman, free negro, or mulatto. Any person who shall intermarry shall be deemed guilty of felony, and on conviction thereof shall be confined to the state penitentiary for life." So as you can see, and probably no surprise to us, the South and many of the southern states had difficulties following the passing of the 13th Amendment, which was the emancipation, and as the country attempted to move forward. And what you're going to begin to see is that the role of the federal government began to increase in terms of its oversight, especially of those southern states, and later on in the West, due to the lack of government to say or criminal justice system, an effective criminal justice system. So the civil rights legislation and due process that was taking place during this era, you can read it here, but the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment providing equal protection and citizenship to black slaves, the 15th Amendment basically saying you can't prevent voting because of race. We began to see the influence of the Ku Klux Klan during this time period, ultimately which led to the Klan Act of 1871, which is basically an act to enforce the 14th Amendment based on the influence of the Ku Klux Klan on white sympathizers of the Southern blacks, as well as black emancipated slaves themselves. The book talks about the birth of drug legislation. You can read that, but understand that these were laws that were established to marginalize segments of society, specifically the Chinese and the use of opium, African Americans and the use of cocaine, Hispanics and the use of marijuana. So I think it's important just to know that during this period of time, we began to see legislation passed as a means to control marginalized segments of our society. And you might ask yourself, what type of laws do we have today that might reflect that sentiment? During the 1980s, for example, when crack cocaine was at its height, we saw that crack cocaine was punished differently than powdered cocaine. And oftentimes crack cocaine was associated with inner city minorities, where powdered cocaine was more associated with middle upper class whites who were using the illegal drug. So the punishment was different for possession of the same type of drug. Rationale by Congress and others was that crack cocaine was more addictive, more dangerous. But nonetheless, you can see where legislative bodies had the ability to create legislation to maybe focus on a particular group in our society. So just ask yourselves maybe what kind of laws are out there today that might reflect this same type of sentiment. Law enforcement between 1875 and 1865, or 1845 and 1865, major cities began to establish more proficient police forces that emphasized prevention over detection. Police were often thought of as a creation to control dangerous classes. In other words, it was a means to control these dangerous classes within pockets of communities. And in a lot of big urban environments such as New York at the time, Philadelphia, Boston, and so forth, communities were typically, you might have an Irish community, or you might have this community or that community. So in essence, policing was designed to control for those dangerous classes. You began to see some changes. Some cities might have implemented a residency requirement. And key, I think, is we began to see black police officers first emerge in northern cities in around the 1870s. Now, urban policing, issue of partisanship, conflict between between local and state control, and the whole role of federal law enforcement, specifically that of U.S. Marshals. You began to see that the federal government began to take a more focused approach to dealing with states following the Emancipation Declaration of the 13th Amendment, especially those states of the South. So you began to see the focus of federal law enforcement actually begin to change somewhat. State policing never really caught on until probably the late 19th century. And different states have different roles for their state police. Some might be more of a highway patrol. Some might, in fact, be state police that have investigatory powers, homicides, and so forth, depending on how the state law enforcement is structured. But it was just one of the things that didn't quite catch on until the late 19th centuries and maybe into the 20th century, where you began to see state policing begin to emerge. The whole concept of state police might have had a negative connotation. People would rather have more localized control over their policing versus some level of state police. Corrections began to see a rise in populations following the Civil War. The role of the reformatory movement, which we go into more detail probably in Chapter 8. And the South implemented convict leasing. And primarily, convict leasing was a means in which contractors could use cheap labor, prison labor, of a sort of projects. A lot of this was done in part because, remember, the South had been destroyed considerably because of the war. So prisons and jails were often destroyed, and so as a means to raise some money, southern states and localities began to lease out convicts as a means to generate some revenue, and then obviously those revenues were put back into the building of prisons and jails and so forth. We also began to see the concept of the Irish system, which is basically graduated release, and it was referred to as ticket of release in the Irish system. And so sort of that concept of inmates behaving themselves, the whole idea being that eventually they would be released back into society once they served a period of time and were able to prove themselves. The Elmira Reformatory was part of the Reformatory movement. It was set up for use between the ages of 16 to 30 who were serving their first time in prison. And this used the indeterminate sentencing process and the mark system. And the indeterminate process was where you'd be sentenced, for example, something like 5 to 10 years, and based on how well you did in prison and how well you behaved yourself then you might get out earlier. If you didn't behave yourself, you might get out later. The mark system, again, was a means where you might be able to get an early release for good time, which then would allow you to get on parole and be back into society and assimilating back into the good graces of the community. Crime and punishment, more crime during this time was associated around less violent crime and more towards property crimes such as embezzlement, petty theft, larceny, gambling, prostitution, drunkenness, and disorderly conduct. Unfortunately, during this time period, professional criminals were technically superior to the police, and so the police still lacked that professionalism that was needed. That would obviously come later in the next couple of chapters. We'll read about that. You'll find out that there was a birth of organized crime. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail here, but read about the birth of organized criminal activity. And you could also read about the issue of capital punishment. Capital punishment no longer became an issue for some reformers because it was basically taken out of public view. There were no longer public executions, and so since they couldn't be privy to what was taking place, the reformers took up other causes that came their way. And one of them might have been juvenile justice, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. Violence, you began to see a resurgence in sectional violence over slavery issues. Also contributing to the rise of tide of violence in the 1850s was the growth in American gun production. So much like today, the relationship between crime and guns and people and guns, which goes back and forth, has been debated, and it's still debated even to this day. But know that it started obviously clearly back in the 1850s. Birth of domestic terrorism, you can read about that. Many parts of the country are dealing with violence associated with sectional leanings. In Kansas, Nebraska, Missouri, for example. In New York City, there were draft riots, which were initiated by, in this case, Irish draftees, who told they were going to go to the South to free the slaves, who then they believed would take their jobs in the North. So a lot of instability going on in major cities. There were riots and things such as that. So understand that there was a lot of racial tension going on towards the end of the Civil War period and shortly after the Civil War period. And this all had to be dealt with by the fledgling police force of the New York City Police Department. Read about the Ku Klux Klan, its evolution, and its role in the criminal justice system in terms of its impact on the South, and then you can take a look at some of the Reconstruction violence that was associated with the time period. Interracial violence, again, take a look at that. Certain Southerners refused to recognize emancipation of blacks, and on occasion freedmen were beaten, killed, and mutilated. Local law enforcement at the time, especially in the South, often supported white Southerners. In the South, justice continued to be color conscious for blacks, and a significant amount of Indian-white confrontation was beginning to take place in the West during this particular period of time. Okay? So, again, just understand that the Civil War generated extraordinary problems for the American criminal justice system. And following the Civil War, or the end of the Civil War, we had new forms of criminality taking place. Within the United States, again, we began to see the rise of gangs and mobs and so forth, and just an array of factors that took place as society became more diverse and dealing with many of the tensions associated with this particular time period. Okay, so I hope this helped somewhat. Again, if you have any questions, by all means, please go ahead and get a hold of me. Please note the key terms at the end of the chapter on page 163, as I think they will help you in a better understanding of the key concepts. All right. As always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me, and I look forward to interacting with you in the coming weeks. Thank you guys so much. Bye.